So now I would like to introduce my coach for a lifetime, Mr. Simon Cataldo.
That's the first time you guys have shushed yourselves.
Get a clap.
Typically, I'm asked to speak at events like this about the historical arc of Harlem Lacrosse, and tonight's different. Tonight is special. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a 7-month period in 2009. And I'd like to invite all of you to join me in going back to March of 2009. We had been practicing on the handball court beside Frederick Douglass Academy for several months. We had used equipment, much of it donated from my hometown of Concord, Mass. We had just a few balls for each practice, which would invariably, as Daniel mentioned, all be lost to the other side of the fence within 45 minutes, at which point I would blow the whistle and everyone would go to the line for sprints and laps for the next hour and 15 minutes. About a year later, the bodega across the street would start selling lacrosse balls, but we weren't there yet. We had a first aid kit that had to be replenished with Band-Aids every single practice because of scraped knees. We had a clipboard, we had a whistle, and we had each other. When it rained, we still played on the concrete. When it snowed, we stayed inside and ran laps around the second floor hallway and up and down the stairs. At the beginning, that's what lacrosse was for us. And for the privilege of participating, they got mandatory study halls at lunchtime and after school. There were so many days when you could have quit. By March, I realized that these boys were getting good enough to compete. There were no other middle school lacrosse teams in New York City public schools, so I called all of the Ivy Preparatory League private day schools. And either there'd be no response or it was something like, "That's nice what you're doing, our schedule is full." A friend connected me with Mount St. Michael's Academy, a Catholic high school in Westchester, which had just started a lacrosse team for their high schoolers, and a bunch of football players were playing lacrosse. So we went up and played them. We got to the first face-off, and from the wing, Kevin Goshorn, Kevin, where are you? You can't, 110 pounds, soaking wet, runs at 20 miles an hour into the middle of the field, and smack, he's cut down by a kid who looked like he'd be playing linebacker at Rutgers in a year. There were 2 parents there. One of them was Kevin's mom. The other one was my boss. And, we go in, and we peel Kevin up. He's okay. 9 years later, he was the captain of Haverford College's lacrosse team. We lost that game 7-5. Saul scored all 5 of the goals. He let Kamau assist on one of them.
Hey.
Daniel ran down that field like his feet weren't touching the ground. It was a beautiful thing to watch, and it hardly mattered that most of the time he had dropped the ball at the other end and didn't even know. Carlos had 32 ground balls. I checked my notes. 29 were ground balls that he dropped. But I was so proud, and the next day the principal, Dr. Hodge, may he rest in peace, went on the loudspeaker and talked about our achievement and talked about Saul's scoring, and we had something. So I kept calling the Ivy Prep League teams. A modest name, by the way, that league. And finally, we found one, and our principal, Dr. Hodge, agreed to pay for Metro North tickets for us to get to the game. This was a big expenditure for our school. So we boarded the 3 train down to 125th Street. We walked across Harlem, took in all the weird looks, got to the Metro North, and rode up to Westchester. Then we got off the train. We walked a mile to the school up a very steep hill, and it started to rain. And I can remember, and I can see, and I can hear the kids' sneakers slipping on that pavement as they walked, because most of them were only about twice the weight of the equipment they were carrying. And so we waited in the school's cafeteria overlooking a beautiful field. They were so excited to play on this field. And we saw the referees arrive, and meanwhile the coach came to me and expressed some surprise at the size of the kids on our team. We waited, and about an hour later we were told by a coach on the other team that the game had been canceled due to lightning. And I hadn't seen any lightning. So we lugged our stuff back to Harlem. We hadn't even played the game, and it was after 8 p.m., just when we got to the school. The boys were distraught. They knew something wasn't right. I was 22 years old and didn't know how to explain what had happened. And I thought that might be it for us. It was a Friday, and I didn't know if anyone would show up at practice the next week. So I had to go to school the following day for test prep. And as I'm walking up to school, there are the kids. They're on the handball court practicing. And that's what they kept doing, with the exception of one other game against Mount St. Michael's, which we lost. And it's actually funny that Daniel said we kept losing and losing. Daniel was an 8th grader that year, and I'm just so glad he said that, because the truth is, it was only 2 games. But that was everything. That was everything that they had. And they just kept practicing through the summer, through the fall, and finally, I got one of those Ivy Prep League teams to say yes. The athletic director was black, and he coached the game himself. So much of the special education staff and a cohort of parents came to see that game. Our goalie was suspended, so naturally Robert, who had lost his glasses and was legally blind, played goalie. And it didn't matter. We were better. We won 11-5. And suddenly everybody in the Ivy Prep League would play us, and we beat them too. So you might be asking yourself, why, for those 7 months, did they keep going? And I invite you to ask yourself whether you or your children would have continued playing a sport that offered a 22-year-old coach who was overwhelmed in his classroom and had no experience, an assistant coach who was only slightly better, shout out Paul DiCarlo, a handball court, inadequate equipment, no transportation, practices that involved mostly running, physical punishment, and bloody knees. Out of balls 45 minutes in, and we were on the line. Well, we talked about that. We would take a knee at practice, and we would consciously and explicitly make the decision that it was worth persevering for the benefit of kids who we didn't know. For those who would come after them on the handball court, as 11 and 12 and 13-year-olds, they did it for other children who they did not know. Think about that. They made that decision, that commitment, and they followed through. And I promised them only 2 things in return. One, that I'd keep showing up every day, and if they did this, they'd be remembered. Well, look at what you did, fellas. In the past 3 years, I've twice become the father of sons. When they're old enough to understand, I'll tell them what you did too. And it's my hope as a dad that they'll do as much good for the world as every single one of you has done.